This is the Reading with Rochelle podcast, where we will explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rochelle Chase, an author and a columnist, and this week's book is Savings and Trust: The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank by Dr. Justene Hill Edwards. After the Civil War ended, as formerly enslaved Black Americans began making money, they had nowhere to safely keep it. On March 3, 1865, the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company was established to receive their deposits. In its heyday, Edwards writes that freed people had opened over 100,000 accounts and deposited over $50 million, which is about $1.4 billion today. Despite depositing these millions of dollars into the bank, Black depositors could not borrow money from the bank. But bank administrators and trustees did. They started making and taking loans and sometimes simply stealing deposits. Other white people affiliated with the bank trustees were invited to borrow Black depositors' funds without applying to do so, without collateral, and to invest in risky ventures. This led to the collapse of the bank. By the time it was forced to close 9 years later, the remaining 61,144 depositors had no access to money left in the bank's accounts. In this week's episode, Justene Hill Edwards and I discuss the history of the Freedmen's Bank, its impact today, and more. A little bit about Justene. Dr. Justene Hill Edwards is an associate professor of history in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. In addition to Savings and Trust: The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank, she is also the author of Unfree Markets: The Slave's Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. She has won numerous awards and prizes, and you can learn much more about her at JusteneHillEdwards.com. All right. Well, welcome, Justene. I am so happy to have you on Reading with Rochelle today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I was going to tell you first that I read Savings and Trust: The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. I read that pretty much overnight. I mean, I usually think, oh, I need to have time, especially for history books, but yours was just, I didn't know pretty much a lot of it, most of it. And so it was really interesting.
Thank you so much. I mean,
Yeah.
that means a lot because I really wanted to write the book in a way that it felt kind of compelling and kind of like a thriller. And so
Yeah.
that was great to hear. So thank you.
Yep, it was. So let's start. So immediately after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bank is created. Can you just tell us, first of all, what is this bank and what was the purpose of it? Just to
Sure.
get everybody on the same page.
Well, the Freedmen's Bank, created as the Freedman Savings and Trust Company, I call it the Freedmen's Bank, was a savings bank created at the end of the Civil War for the nation's almost 4 million recently emancipated African Americans. And so we are talking about a population of people really emerging and transitioning out of a period of slavery through the war and into this very kind of nebulous and unclear period of freedom. And so the bank was created by white bankers, philanthropists, politicians, abolitionists to help African Americans make that transition financially from slavery to freedom, to kind of help them save money to do things that they wanted, which was essentially to reunite with families, buy land, and to help them again in this new period of freedom.
Mm-hmm. And I think you said that it wasn't necessarily totally altruistic when they set that up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the messages that I really wanted to convey in the book, and one of the lessons that I really learned through researching this book, was that I think it is easy to believe that this bank, this financial institution, was kind of a benevolent, altruistic one, right?
Mm.
That white progressives, we might call them, were really wanting to help African Americans make this transition. But I think if we really dig into the history of the bank, look at the motivations of the bank's white administrators and trustees, and really examine the bank through the experiences of the African American depositors, we get a very different idea about what the bank's fundamental mission was compared to actually how the bank functioned and why it failed.
What I think really struck me also is the amount of money. You have all these people that are just recently experiencing freedom, and there is all this money. I mean, the from the military banks, I think you were talking about that, the soldiers that were first starting. You had a line in there where you said they had nowhere to put their money. They're now being paid equal to white soldiers. They have nowhere to put their money. And a truck is filled with like $75,000 in black soldiers' pay
Yeah.
because there's nowhere, they're either giving it to white people to keep, or they're burying it, or
Mhm.
there's nowhere to put it. So I think that was really surprising. Then when you have these charts about the bank itself, talk a little bit about that, because I think that's not something a lot of people think of, that all this money that was out there that black people have nothing to do with.
Sure. Well, I'll answer that in two parts. The
Mm,
first part is about the actual practicalities of freedom. I mean, I think even among historians, we really underestimate the challenges that African Americans faced coming out of the Civil War. What
yeah.
were they doing practically? What they wanted to do first and foremost was to find their families and reunite with their families. And so that's
Mm,
one. But secondly, especially for Black soldiers, practically what were they going to do with money that by and large they wanted to send back to their wives and their families? There was kind of no place to actually put their what they earned. There were paymasters who would collect money and distribute money to families if they could, but practically this was a quandary, and not just for black soldiers but for white soldiers too. But it was even more challenging for black soldiers as they were really trying to figure out how they would save money. And so, in many ways, the military savings banks established in 1864, there were three, one in Norfolk, Virginia, Beaufort, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, helped Black soldiers with this challenge of figuring out how to save their money. So practically, that's one thing, right? But on the other hand, we're talking about a surprising amount of money. We are talking about African Americans in the bank's first few years depositing about $1.7 million by 1867 in the bank. And that is kind of an astounding amount. That's tens or if not hundreds of millions of dollars compounded today. And so one of the messages that I really wanted to convey in the book was this idea that yes, African Americans were again emerging out of slavery, but they had very specific understandings of money, of how to earn money, how to save money, what they wanted to spend their money on. And so the bank, from the African American perspective, was a reflection of that, was a reflection of all of their hard work, all of their dedication, and what they were bringing into this new period of freedom economically, which was work, labor, money. And what they wanted to do with that money was buy property and build wealth.
mhm. And you have some instances in there where there's this kind of this disbelief for these white people that are talking to these black people, thinking that, oh, they need to be taught how to handle, I mean, that just like, I had to roll my eyes and laugh a little bit. They needed to be taught how to handle freedom. They need to be taught the principles of saving and investing. But yet and still you call out these various ways in which black people had gotten those skills through the pretty much the violence and sometimes of slavery. Did you want to add a little bit more about that, or?
Yeah. Well,
Mhm,
this is a topic that I talk about in my first book, Free
mm,
Markets, where I look at the economic lives of the enslaved during slavery. And I mean, me as a historian, I've spent my career studying this, but I also think even historians are surprised by the fact that the enslaved were actually pretty adept at figuring out how to make and save money. And even though it may not have been fully legal, there were ways in which this, what historians call the slaves economy, was very, very visible, was biracial, meaning that it was not uncommon for the enslaved to trade amongst themselves, to trade with poor whites, even to buy and sell goods with their enslavers. And one of the reasons why this happened was because enslavers figured out pretty quickly that these types of economic activities that is allowing slaves to make money, to pursue employment opportunities outside of the plantation complex, would not threaten the stability of slavery. And so I thought that was fascinating. And so when I finished that book, I was thinking about, well, what was the knowledge, the economic knowledge that African Americans brought with them into the period of freedom? And they understood ideas of again, making money and saving money. They understood these kind of complex ideas in the world of finance, the ideas of mortgaging, right? Because the enslaved themselves were capital. Their enslavers would often mortgage slaves to pay off debts, right? And so there is this idea that much of the financial knowledge that African Americans brought with them into the period of freedom was, as I say, forged through the violence of slavery, which I think is an important message to kind of keep with us as we understand this relationship between kind of wealth building, capitalism, and perhaps the persistence of the racial wealth gap.
I think what came to mind also when I was reading that was, well, you think about a lot of times white people would just talk as if slaves were not there. So not only are you being forced to do the work, you're also kind of hearing these things and how you are being made, money is being made off of your efforts. And so I think I thought of some of that too, that would also help to give them that some business and financial knowledge as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the perhaps the saddest examples of this is Black women knowing that they were giving birth to the next generation of slaves and of capital for enslavers, right? Their
Yeah.
ideas, their understandings in particular were forged through the tragedies of childbirth and child rearing. Again, I think it's fascinating kind of looking at the marketing materials that the bank was putting out, especially in its first few years between 1865 and 1870. A lot of the marketing materials would say, like, save the small sums, forego liquor and tobacco, and put all of your pennies and dollars in your Freedman's bank accounts. A little bit will go a long way to helping you do what you need to do in this new period of freedom, which was buy land and build wealth. And so there was this kind of misalignment that I talk about between the white bank administrators and the trustees and the Black depositors, because Black depositors were using the bank in ways that were kind of different than the ways that white bank administrators hoped that they would. And I think
Mhm.
that's a fascinating part of this story too, is that misalignment.
Mhm. How are they marketing to when you talk about some of the words that they're using, but you've got this just people are just like I said, Black people are now free and they have very recent memories of their enslavers, and now you've got this bank that is being run by white men. It's like, so how are they overcoming that to get these Black people to deposit money in this bank?
Sure. Well, in the first few years, really, but between 1865 and 1867, the bank was sending out surrogates to go to Black communities across the South, especially cities with high Black populations, and encouraging them to open Freedmen's bank accounts once a branch opened in their city. I talk about this, I believe it's in chapter 2, where a small group of white bank administrators go to Richmond, and they go to a Black church, and they are meeting with Black congregants, and these congregants, mostly men, were essentially peppering them with questions about how the bank was structured, how their deposits were going to be protected or not protected. And even the bank's administrators were surprised that they were posing these types of questions, right? They wanted to know if former Confederates were going to be on the bank's board of trustees. The answer was no. They wanted to know, interestingly enough, if their deposits would be backed by essentially the full faith and credit of the federal government. The answer to that practically was no, even though the white bank administrators didn't say so. And so there's all of these conversations that African Americans were having with whites, but also amongst themselves about their potential investments in the bank, especially in the first few years.
Okay, so you have this marketing effort is working. You've got Black people depositing money, and I think you had said in the heyday, it was up to like over 100,000 accounts and $50 million, which is 1 point something billion, I think you said today. So
Yeah.
you've got this marketing effort is working. You have it. So then now what happens? So it seems like there's this shift because now they didn't really plan this well. It was rushed to get this bank set up. And so now you've got all these expenses. They aren't being able to cover these branches, these salaries, et cetera. So now what's happening? What's beginning to happen now?
Sure. Well, it is worth saying that when the bank was established on March 3rd of 1865, it was established as a simple savings bank, which meant that the bank was set up to accept deposits, give depositors a small amount of interest if they kept their money in the bank for about 6 months to a year. And then that was essentially it. The bank's deposits were supposed to be invested in government bonds and securities, which at this point, and it really continues to be the most stable financial product. And so it was supposed to operate with the least amount of risk possible. But what this meant was that with the kind of rapid expansion of the bank between 1865 and 1867, with the shifting of the bank's president and vice president, and with African Americans, yes, depositing hundreds of thousands, soon to be millions of dollars in the bank, but not actually leaving money in the bank for enough time to make the investments pay off. African Americans were essentially using the bank not as a savings account, but essentially as a checking account, putting money in the bank, putting it there for as long as they wanted, and then withdrawing it to buy what they wanted, which was land and machinery. And so by 1867, the bank's main office was in New York, a couple blocks from Wall Street. The bank's president at that time, Malhun Hewitt, he steps down and says that he's really not equipped to handle the bank. And he kind of, I think, foresees changes and does not want to be affiliated with the bank. The bank's founder, his name is John Alvord, is on the board of trustees. And he decides to convince the other members of the board to move the bank's main office from New York to Washington. And so this is a big deal. One, it means that many of the first trustees leave the board. It means that the bank's main office moves from one of the centers of financial power to the center of political power. And this shifts the bank's fundamental mission, especially with the addition of a handful of trustees, namely an investment banker named Henry Cook. When Henry Cook agrees to join the board and becomes the bank's finance chairman, this is kind of when all of the hijinks starts. He brings on a friend and business partner named Daniel Eaton. Eaton becomes the bank's actuary. And so he's the person who evaluates the bank's investment portfolio in terms of risk. He actually takes the bank's first illegal loan within days of accepting that position. It's $4,000, and he pays it back shortly thereafter. But legally, the bank is not supposed to lend money. And so it does so as the bank is making this transition to DC, as new board members are coming on to the bank's board of trustees, and as Henry Cook, who is the brother of Jay Cook, a very important investment banker, friend of Lincoln, friend of Salmon P. Chase, who was a Treasury Secretary during the war, friend of many of the men who work in the Department of War. And so we are kind of getting a cabal of white men who are less concerned with the financial stability of African Americans and more concerned with increasingly using the bank's deposits to fund their own risky investments at this time.
Mhm.
That was a lot.
Yeah, I felt like I needed to draw a chart to figure out all of the relationships. Like they're loaning their money to friends, but then or to friends or other businesses, but then they're involved in that business, and but so they're getting that money, or they're part of the trustee, they're on the board, but then they're selling bonds, so they get a percentage of that. I mean, it's like it was just so convoluted to see
Mhm.
how all of these millions of dollars are like going out to people, and there's no application process. I mean, it's just like, hey, I need the money. It was just amazing. That was shocking to me. It shouldn't have been, but it was.
Well, and I was really surprised at the small network of people I was looking at, knowing that Henry Cook, for example, is from Ohio. And
Mm,
he was a close friend of Salmon P. Chase when they were both in Ohio, when Chase was the governor of Ohio.
mm,
And so that relationship carried through when Lincoln, during the war, needed to raise money. And who did he go to? He went to Henry and J. Cook to help raise about $1.5 billion to fund the war effort. And
mm,
so, again, we are talking about like a small group of people. The fact
yeah.
that General O. Howard, who founded Howard University, was contracting out with D.L. Eaton to help buy building equipment for Howard. And we're talking about people who again are working with the Freedmen's Bank, working with the Freedmen's Bureau, working with Howard University, working with the Department of War, friends with all of these really important political and economic players, and they are all tapping into the deposits of the Freedmen's Bank. And so it becomes legal in May of 1870, the bank's board of trustees, led by Henry Cook, lobby members of Congress, their friends and colleagues, and business partners to amend the bank's charter to allow it to operate not as a savings bank, but a commercial bank, which means that legally Congress gave the bank permission to make loans.
Hmm.
And this is where things really go off the rails, so to speak. Many of the loans, the majority of the loans, about 95% of the loan volume, went to white borrowers in and around DC, and those borrowers disproportionately were friends, colleagues, business partners of members of the Board of Trustees.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's a story of plunder. It's a story of partisanship. Again, we are talking about the majority of these men, these white men, were white Republicans. They were affiliates of Lincoln, supported Lincoln's cause, supported the Union cause.
Hmm. And yet, and still, then you had mentioned that the Black people that were investing or depositing their money couldn't get loans. They were, it seems like that little chart, the chart you had, they were barely getting any interest. It was
Yeah,
like, wow. And
yeah,
yet millions are being made off of their deposits. Yeah.
absolutely. And flowing out of the bank such that sometimes when depositors across the South wanted to withdraw money, they couldn't.
Hmm.
And so it shifted a lot of capital, a lot of money to the Washington, D.C. branch and away from the branches that really needed the capital, the funds. And this was in Black communities throughout the South.
Hmm. I don't want to talk about everything in the book. I mean, there's so much more from what we've even talked about, but do you want to talk a little bit about the collapse and how this led to that and
I
how Frederick Douglass gets
was
involved?
about to say we have
Yeah.
to talk
Yeah,
about
we got to
Douglas.
talk about him.
Yes, okay. And so as hundreds of thousands, soon to be millions of dollars flow out of the bank to borrowers in and around DC, a financial collapse is kind of on the horizon. And so historians call this the Panic of 1873, and it's a major financial depression that happens in the fall of that year. One of the catalysts was the failure of investment bank J. Cook and Company. By this time, Henry Cook had been borrowing money from the bank. We learn later during a congressional inquiry that it's about $500,000 that he borrows from the bank without collateral. And he is essentially investing that money in the Northern Pacific Railroad. Now, this was a massive undertaking. This was a period of time when railroad construction was hot. The federal government was investing in it, but it was still seen to be kind of a risky investment. The Cook brothers had started to raise funds, but were not as successful as they'd hoped to be. And so a financial collapse that starts in Eastern Europe kind of trickles across Western Europe and then across the Atlantic. And the Northern Pacific Railroad is one of the casualties. Soon after that, J. Cook and Company fails, and this kind of starts one of the first major depressions after the Civil War. Of course, African Americans hear about this pretty quickly because it's kind of circulating around the country, and they make runs on bank branches, which is, of course, not uncommon. Of course, they would. And so by January of 1874, by this time, John Alvord, the bank's president, the bank's founder, is president. And the board of trustees just decides that they really no longer have full confidence that he is doing a good job. They kind of signal this throughout the years, really starting in 1871, but it really is at the beginning of 1874 when they say we're not sure if he's the right person for a whole host of reasons. And so a small group of Black trustees at this point, they're about 3, they get together and they really hope that the bank can be redeemed. They encourage Frederick Douglass, who himself was a depositor. He opens an account in 1871. They encourage him to think about joining the bank as the bank's president. He had been a very public supporter of the bank since its inception. He had encouraged African Americans around the country to open accounts, and he was actually writing about and speaking about the fact that he saw the bank as like a public representation of the political and economic power of the recently emancipated of African Americans. He decides to accept. Alvord steps down, and so in March and April of 1874, he starts to kind of get into the position, starts to look at the books, and he realizes pretty quickly that the books are all over the place. By this time, about $3.5 million had been loaned out. About 95% of that loan value was in default, and so most of the loans had not been paid back. He's hearing from African Americans, and they're saying that they don't have access to their funds. And the bank has a dwindling amount of money on hand, much less than the $3.5 million that had been loaned out. And so he decides to kind of rally the troops, and he issues 2 statements that spring to try to encourage the depositors not to withdraw any more money, to kind of have faith and trust that he can redeem the bank's reputation, but he couldn't do it. And so in July, specifically July 2nd of 1874, the bank closes. And again, the bank has about $3.5 million loaned out, but they had about $2.9 million still outstanding from depositors who had money in their bank accounts. And so the bank closes, and Frederick Douglass is essentially left with the reputation of being the president of the Freedmen's Bank when it collapsed, which was something that followed him for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm. It was another one of those, I don't know what to say. It's not funny, like ha ha funny, but I guess ironic is then Black people are now being blamed. Not only Frederick Douglass, but Black people are being blamed for this failure, this collapse. I forget. I think you said they should have known. I don't know. It was just, could you just tell me, there were like some ridiculous reasons that Black people were blamed for this. I just, yeah,
Yeah.
I just,
Well, in the years after the bank failed, there are a series of congressional inquiries. And this is also, interestingly enough, a period of time during Reconstruction where Democrats are starting to kind of reemerge in Congress, especially former Confederates. And so they are using the Freedmen's Bank failure to show that Republicans were really not on the side of African Americans, because they contended if they were, then they would not have let the bank fail, which was actually not a lie. But this became incredibly politically charged. And so in the subsequent years, there are congressional inquiries, and all of this kind of information comes out, and Democratic senators and congressmen are saying that African Americans were clearly not ready for the responsibilities of freedom, that they should not have trusted white bankers with their money. Everybody knows that savings banks and banks in general are risky ventures, been the least risky of them, which were supposed to be savings banks. And if anything, this was a lesson for African Americans that you have to protect yourself, because the federal government is not going to protect you and whites are not going to protect you, which was just kind of a startling message, essentially blaming African Americans for the bank's failure. And there is an interplay that I talk about at the end of the book from one of the bank's white administrators, Anson Sperry, and a congressman from Minnesota. And so they are kind of going back and forth, actually in the early 20th century, where the congressman, the Democratic congressman, is saying that, like, you are one of the reasons why the bank failed. African Americans should not have trusted you, that this is their failure and they have to take responsibility for it, which is just insane. But an interesting way to think about how whites, especially white Democrats, were using the bank to further their own political goals.
So what are some of the lasting ramifications today because of this?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons why I'm really happy we settled on the terms savings and trust for the book's title is because I think that trust is such an important part of not just this story, but what happened in the generations after the bank failed. I write in the book's conclusion that we continue to talk about kind of racial and economic inequality. We continue to talk about the racial wealth gap. And there is something to be said about the ways that African Americans kind of have generational distrust of traditional banks. I mean, that distrust does not dissipate, like, it has to go somewhere. And so what happened, especially in the 50, 60 years after the bank failed, was that African Americans started to create their own financial institutions. They started to not rely on traditional banks, right? And so when we talk about places like Tulsa, or we talk about places like Raleigh in terms of Black economic enclaves, this is what we're talking about. But even today, I mean, the end of October, the Department of Treasury released a report about kind of steps towards broader efforts at financial inclusion, and trust was a major part of it. Recognizing the financial services industry and financial regulators needing to recognize that there are communities of Americans that don't trust traditional banks. And we understand that to get a mortgage, for example, consumers have to have a sustained relationship with the financial institution. To have access to credit, you have to have a sustained relationship with the financial institution. And without that, you can't qualify to access the major wealth building tools that we have in this country. And so kind of thinking about where those behaviors come from and really grappling with that as a country, especially on the financial services side, I think is really important.
it triggered for me when you're talking about this trust. It reminded me when I was younger and I'd go over to my great grandmother's house and she would say, "Oh, go get me some money under the rug." And so it was like saved, and it was always a different space, a different spot. I mean, it was like money all over. And it made me think of, it's like, you know what? I don't think she trusted banks at that time either. And that was her way of saying, I'm not putting my money in the bank. And yeah, so it reminded me of that childhood memory. And I
And
don't think that's unique.
well, I'm not sure if you remember the Fannie Willis trial in Georgia. And
No.
so she was the prosecutor of the kind of Trump election trial in Georgia. I think it was last year.
Mm-hmm.
And she's on trial, and she is talking about paying for trips, paying for restaurants in cash. And
Mm-hmm.
she mentioned on the stand under oath that her father had told her she has to have several $1,000s in cash at home just in case. And
Mm-hmm.
so everybody in the media was kind of making fun of her about it. But I had friends and colleagues texting me saying, this is why your book is important. Like, this comes from
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, I still have family members who store money under mattresses and coffee cans behind book. Like, this is a thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so I think these behaviors again come from somewhere, and I hope people will read the book and kind of make that connection.
Yeah. I was going to say that is the connection I made, because I've been thinking about these things, like, where do these things come from? Where do these beliefs, they come from somewhere, and not just a generalized distrust. And it really did connect the dots for me when I read this, because again, I had no idea about the bank and what had happened. So it was very enlightening, very enlightening. So
Thank you.
you mentioned your other book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Sure. It's called Unfree Markets, the Slaves Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. And it was based on my PhD research, and it came out in 2021. And I've been interested in this intersection between slavery, race, and capitalism. And I wanted to look at how the enslaved thought about all of these things. How were they not just slaves and property, but economic actors with a worldview about money, about finance, and really about themselves as capital. And so that's what the first book is about. And I focus it in South Carolina because South Carolina was the first place where, in the historical record in the colonial Americas, we see the enslaved having money very, very publicly and trading very publicly. And so I've been interested in kind of Black economic life for a while now. And so that's where the first book and now this book, Savings and Trust, come in.
Yeah. Well, I was intrigued by that one too. I bought it and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to read this one too. Yeah. So where can people find out more about you and your book, Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank? Where can they find out more?
Sure. It should be available at your local bookseller. You can find me online, JusteneHillEdwards.com. I'm on X, kind of. Justene H. Edwards, and you can find me on the History Department's website at the University of Virginia.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on Reading with Rochelle. This has been great, and I am looking forward to your next book.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Thank you.